actually delayed your entry to morning tea, but then you clapped and applauded on cue, which means you are ready for the next stage of your mobilisation. Our next plenary, folks, and hopefully you enjoyed morning tea and got a chance to have a chat with some folks, is all about communicating the climate emergency. We're going to get straight into it because there are some really amazing speakers, people that have been in this space doing the hard work for a long time, trying to help us work out how to talk about this. So thank you so much for coming back. And I mentioned this before, when many of us first heard the term climate emergency, some of us might have had that experience of this is a bit much, this will scare people off. And I shared with you, in fact, that was my reaction and, in fact, my visceral reaction to the framing. In this session, we're going to talk about how we communicate about the climate emergency, how we talk about the urgency, and how we bring people along on the mobilisation journey. Our first speaker is someone who has been doing this. In fact, he's probably spoken to you, your fellow councillors or council officers or a council not far from yours. Adrian Whitehead is a long-time climate activist, a leader in the climate emergency movement, founder of Beyond Zero Emissions, an active member of Climate Emergency Australia, and one of the organisers of the conference today that you are at. So he's part of the reason why you're here. Adrian is also the person that accosted me in the car park. Adrian and I have known each other for a very long time, and we're in fact neighbours. Our kids go to school together, and I know where he lives if we don't get our act together, all right? Because he's not a prepper, but he is prepared. And I know that Adrian has been thinking about the challenges we face as a society, as a nation, as a planet for a very long time, much longer than most of us, and has thought about how we talk about this stuff. Please, before I introduce Adrian, I will say he's speaking here today as an individual and he has all that rich history. He also does work at Maribyrnong Council, but he's not representing the council. He's here today speaking from his own views, which is why he can say whatever the damn hell he likes. Please join me in welcoming Adrian Whitehead.
Got sound? Oh, there we go. All right, thanks very much for all coming here today. It's fantastic to see you all. I got badly concussed on Monday, so anything I say from now is just like let it go. And of course, it was nice working for Maribyrnong Council while it lasted. So there we go. I'm talking today about the silent emergency. So I think really, as David was saying, it starts with truth, but the truth must be spoken. So you can, if you keep it behind a locked door and don't actually front with it, nothing's going to happen, even if you know it. So I did a bit of this talk's really quick. It's going to be about that. We're going backwards. There we go. It's the concussion. Don't worry about it. There we go. All right, there we go. Look at that. So we're talking about the silent emergency. And Australians, we do emergency well. Like, we do flashing lights or posts on Instagram, phone things, big signs on the road, whatever. And we respond to emergency and we communicate emergency well. But it's not really happening in the climate space, in the climate emergency space. So I decided to do a bit of research and in my own time. And I did an assessment of the 117 councils listed on the climate emergency declared on the SEDAMIA website, which is the point you go to check which councils have done it around the world. And I did that in late September, early October 23, and here are the results. All right, so climate emergency on the front page of councils, 3 only had it. There was only one with a permanent reference. I really hope it's still there. And it was Moonee Valley City Council. We got Moonee Valley people here. Woo! Thanks, Laura. So only one in all of Australia, people, as the world burns. Anyway, and passing, there were 2 references to it, Valley Council and Bayside news items. One was a CED announcement and one was a climate emergency report. So then I looked at climate on the front page. There were 9 in total, okay? Permanent, there were 2 menu links and there were 7 passing news items. Then I looked at finding the climate emergency reference by clicking through the menu in a fairly natural way, right? So I went here and there and everywhere, but it was clickable. And only 64% of the councils, you can find climate emergency by clicking through their menus, right? So That means 36 required Google searches where you locked in the council you were looking for and the words climate emergency, and then you can find it. And most of those were legacy documents, like funny little PDFs hiding away blind in the website, or they were a legacy news item. And one council, believe it or not, had no reference to climate emergency or climate at all on their website. Okay, one of the CED councils, or formerly CED councils. And on average, it was 2.4 clicks to go in. All right. Then I looked at the framing of the climate emergency and or climate page. And the main frame was climate action with 19 councils. Climate emergency and climate change separately were 17 councils each. Action and sustainability were 12 councils each. Council action was 1 frame, 5 councils, resilience 4, and 2 each for adaptation, community, climate action and impacts. And then taking this climate emergency framing into account with all main, secondary and subframes, basically 32% of councils had one of the frame, as in that's what they're talking about, the climate emergency. So only 6 had that. Main frame was 2, a key frame, like a key part of the discussion, was 29. A subframe, which is basically a mention, was 35, and 37% had no mention of emergency at all. And these are the declared councils, okay? So the take home from today is, where's Laura there? There, copy Moonee Valley. There we go. Thank you, Moonee Valley. There we go. It's going on the CV apparently. You'll see it on LinkedIn in 10 minutes. Put your climate emergency declaration on the front page of your website, just like you have your First Nations one. Put it below or something. Build a permanent menu link for climate emergency. And we know how to do this in the last 48 seconds because we've done it for COVID, right? We did emergency communication for COVID. So every council, to some degree in Australia, did emergency. Find that person who did it and say, please do this again, but change the words to climate emergency, right? There were funding announcements, infographics, permanent bars at the top of the website, their own major heading called, menu item COVID, et cetera, et cetera. So we've done it before, we can do it again. And I think this is the one thing that is being done worse by all councils. We're doing lots of cool programs. Many councils are doing many good programs, but it doesn't matter if we don't frame it in the emergency and the response that we need to avoid the sort of stuff that Sprat was talking about earlier, right? It's that simple. And I think it's our next move to success. The end at 1 second.
Thank you, Adrian. Thank you, Adrian. Fast action, always a fast presentation. We're going to keep it moving. Next, I'm going to introduce someone who can't join us in person today because she's chosen instead to get married today, which I think demonstrates hope and belief in the future, and hence why we are excited. She's also trying to save the planet as a communications challenge and appearing by pre-record. Please welcome via video to Belinda Noble from Comms Declare.
Hello, thank you so much for joining this session, because saving our planet is a communications challenge, and that's one of the reasons I helped set up Comms Declare, which is trying to get the communications industries to actually support climate action and not reckless overconsumption of goods we don't need. So let's go through a couple of tips of the way you can use communications as part of your climate emergency declaration. Now, when there's an emergency, what we normally see from governments are massive information campaigns, right, to gain support and change behaviour. Unfortunately, we're not seeing that with the climate emergency. What we are seeing is private industry, absolutely unrestricted, ramping up as much support as possible for polluting behaviours and polluting companies. So here's just some examples: big cars, petrol companies, sponsorships of sports, greenwashing, and sometimes just straight up lying, misinformation and disinformation from opponents of climate solutions. So Comms Declare started the Fossil Out Ban campaign 2 years ago because fossil fuels are the new tobacco. We did this campaign with a health frame because globally, air pollution from burning fossil fuels actually kills more people than tobacco, and very few people breathe clean air. So we've banned tobacco advertising in Australia. Let's try banning fossil fuel advertising, or at least putting in some restrictions, putting in some labels so people can make more informed decisions. The progress we've made so far: 16 councils, including Sydney, have voted for fossil fuel restrictions. Every council has been different in what they've put in. We've had bills introduced in New South Wales and the ACT, and there's also a greenwashing federal inquiry underway. Overseas, in France, all ads for fossil fuel energies are banned. We've seen bans in major cities, Amsterdam, Stockholm, many more. I'm starting to lose count. And some of these bans aren't just for fossil fuels, they're also for high carbon products. So big cars, airlines, and 1 or 2 places have actually banned meat advertising. We've had bills introduced for fossil fuel advertising bans in Canada and Ireland, and EU is all over stronger greenwashing laws. Basically, the message is restrictions on fossil fuel advertising and high carbon advertising are inevitable. And in fact, the head of one of the big outdoor advertising companies admitted that just a few days ago at a forum I was at. So you've declared a climate emergency, but you want to harmonise that across all your business, including communications, which is absolutely vital. Here's a couple of ways that you can do it. If you have an events or sponsorship or partnerships policy, very often those policies will have prohibited partners. Just add fossil fuels to those. Often, you know, it's add alcohol gambling, add fossil fuels. If you have advertising infrastructure inside your council, so if you have bus shelters or billboards that you have third-party advertising on, you are within your rights to ask in your next advertising agreement that fossil fuels are not promoted on any of that infrastructure. And another thing that we have seen from councils is that they've adjusted their assets or building policies to prohibit fossil fuel advertising on those properties. So we're talking community centres, sports fields, and we have had councils do this. So if there's a sports team playing at one of your fields, they can't put up a banner if they have a fossil fuel sponsor. They can't put up a banner for that sponsor. If you are a leader, what we need from you is to speak up. And what we've seen from research done, particularly by Behavioural Insights divisions in the UK, is that politicians and trusted organisations supporting climate solutions is absolutely essential for social proof and the mass behaviour change that we need across the country in order to properly tackle this problem. What we're not seeing from governments is the message of urgency. Of course, we've talked about a climate emergency, which helps with that, but anything you can do to boost that is wonderful. You know, councils have been leading on this, but we really do need federal and state governments to step up. So anything you can do to pressure them to do the social licence work, to do the emissions reductions work and communications and reduce demand for polluting products is absolutely essential. The IPCC says behaviour change will be responsible for 40 to 70% of all emissions reductions by 2050. So that's less driving, less flying, etc. But we're not telling people about that. We're not asking them to change their behaviour. So that's actually a really essential part that's being missed at the moment. One other thing I suggest is to ignore the deniers. Don't try and change their minds. They're only 10% of the population. Overwhelmingly, the population knows about climate change, cares about climate change, but is either disengaged or doesn't know what to do about it. So talk to them, get them to change their behaviour. There's worse things than being called woke. Let's move on. From a from a communications professional standpoint, when you're talking to communities, and I guess this is more for councils that are trying to do climate projects, you need to talk to your communities in the frame of the values that they care about. So it's not about what we want to say, it's what they need to hear in order to persuade them to get on board with your projects. So if you're framing your climate comms, trying to get support for a project, but your community is somewhat resistant or conservative, the best tip is to actually talk about the children's future. That is something that everyone cares about. It's a really good way to start the conversation. Another way is to say, we want to preserve nature and enjoy a healthy environment. And a good phrase is, for a better future, let's keep reducing climate pollution. That is a non-political way to get into the conversation that will be more easily digested by slightly resistant communities. If your community is even more resistant, there's other tips, but let's start with this one. The common value problem solution framework is a really good way to have these conversations. So you start with your value, which is we want our children to grow up in a healthy environment. Then frame the problem in your terms. So, but gas corporations are increasing climate pollution to protect their profits. That doesn't sound very good, is it? But look, council's got this easy solution. We're putting in more solar power. And that is a way to frame the conversation so you're more likely to get support for an initiative like putting in solar power. Now, if your community is more resistant and you can't even talk about climate change with them, if they're under the pump, if they're really suffering because of the cost of living crisis, let's talk about the cost of living crisis, right? So we want to be able to afford energy and have a decent standard of living. But energy companies keep putting up prices while making record profits. Let's take the power back with a community microgrid. So you're talking about a value that the community has, you're framing the problem in your own terms, and you're delivering an easy solution, which also, yay, reduces emissions. Quick tips on communication. Show proof of progress already made. If you've done things in the past, or if you know of solutions that are already happening, for example, big companies that are making progress on net zero, talk about that progress, make it sound as part of a progression, not new, not risky. Give hope and easy solutions. Use the term climate pollution, not emissions. We need to try and get away from jargon. Emissions, people don't understand what it means. They don't understand what net zero means. Use everyday language. Don't preach. Don't tell people you should do this, you should do that. People are sick of it. You're the government. Give them the solution, but just make it easy and attractive. And also repeat, repeat, repeat. People need to hear something about 7 times before it starts to sink in. And that's a really important part of changing the narrative, changing behaviour. Just keep embedding those messages. I've gone through this super fast. I'm very, very sorry. But look, if you are interested in having a fossil lab ban or a formal fossil lab ban in your council, please get in touch. I will help write changes to your policies. I'll help write the notice of motion. I'll do everything we can to support you. Just drop us a line at hello@comsdeclare.org. I'm gutted that I'm not there today to meet everyone, but thanks very much for your time and for the opportunity to speak. Bye-bye.
Please do take up that opportunity and contact Belinda. She'd love to hear from you, just not today because she is getting married. And a big thank you to Belinda for sharing that with us. Please join me in welcoming our next speaker on this topic, which is, of course, the wonderful Councillor Bernadette Thomas of Maribyrnong City Council. Please give her a big round of applause.
I'll probably need that. Hi, everyone. I just would firstly like to acknowledge the Wurundjeri, Wurrung and Bunurong peoples of the Kulin Nation. I honour elders and ancestors who have always cared for this place we call Maribyrnong and all who lived here. And I acknowledge the wisdom of country and what the seasons teach us, and that the impacts of climate disruption are a form of colonialism. And it was so nice to turn up today, actually, because I realised that I reckon I know about at least 60% of people in the room, maybe a little higher. So I'm feeling both comfortable but also just a little nervous. So as Trent said, I've been a councillor at Maribyrnong since November 2020. I was partly elected on a climate action platform. And before I was elected, I spent 12 years working with some people who are in the room on climate change and environment projects at Hume City Council. But also, I grew up in the middle of coal country in Singleton in the New South Wales Hunter Valley. So I know how difficult it is to have conversations about anything to do with climate, not using the language climate emergency, but just even raising the issue of getting out of coal and getting into renewables. So I've had some very interesting Christmas conversations, shall we say, with my family and who a number of them worked in the mines or the mining industry. So, but it's incredibly important to have those conversations when you can, and to, you know, choose your words carefully, because it's in that context, it's a very, very personal issue for people who are invested, or whose lives are kind of, the context of their lives is, you know, happens within a fossil fuel kind of context and a fossil fuel community. So as you heard earlier, in early 2019, Maribyrnong, and I'll read the words, acknowledged that we are in a state of climate emergency that requires urgent action by all levels of government, unquote. So this was achieved by a campaign by the community, a small but focused group who lobbied the then council and joined hundreds of other jurisdictions who had themselves declared a climate emergency. And it's not really clear to me why they chose the word acknowledge and not declare, or if there's a difference. I did look the words up, but I couldn't quite, you know, tell whether there was any significant difference. But I do think that language matters when we're communicating the climate emergency ideas and information. What we say and how we say it is important in communicating not only that sense of emergency, but also how we as a council will respond and when we'll respond. And so today I've kind of taken the approach of communication as action. You know, there's the saying that actions speak louder than words, and also because our communities are consistently asking us to act. So for me, the way I act is just as important as what I say. So I've kind of combined those two things. So council delivers hundreds of services for the community as a service provider or as a partner with the community. And there's a lot of competition for space to promote action, to provide information, to engage and inspire the community, and also to report back what is happening. But we must be consistent in our communications, because when we're silent for the community, that can be read as no action. So, or at least that's what the community can be led to think. If they're heavily invested in action and activism, they might think, well, why haven't I heard anything about that EV charger? Maybe it's not going ahead. And if they're less invested, that might lead them to think, well, council doesn't actually care about what's happening in the climate space, so I don't have to do anything either. So climate communications, as far as I can tell, are an ongoing long-term project. It takes time and it takes resources. And it's not like a communications campaign to encourage pet registrations, which is specific, short, and has a very clear call to action. Bring your dog in, get it registered by a certain date. Talking about the climate emergency to an already busy, worried, overworked, anxious and climate concerned community is complex, because the issue, as we know, itself is complex. And in that noisy and increasingly fractured communications landscape, our opportunities to connect and talk to communities about the climate emergency are becoming increasingly limited. So that feels a little bit doom and gloom. But I think there is space for particularly those of us who are councillors, but also for officers working in local government. You'll find your way through, but I'm kind of talking from a councillor perspective here. So the first thing I think you need to do is ask questions. Whatever forum you're at, whether it's in the council chamber, at the ALGA National Conference, at the MAV, at community forums, where state and federal MPs are at, ask questions of decision makers and let them know that it's an issue that you and your community care about, and that collectively we want action from those people. It's important to join the dots. As you heard earlier, in 2022, Maribyrnong was impacted by the floods, and we had about 500 people who lost their homes as a result. And it was talked about as not as a climate-related disaster, but as a natural disaster. And again, here language matters. And while we don't want to add any additional anxiety to the people affected, using specific language opens up a conversation about climate, perhaps for a later date, but it also puts what happened in a climate context. We need to be strategic with our decisions and our thinking and our actions. So seeing the climate element in everything we do. If we're looking at infrastructure plans, if we're looking at budgets, if we're looking at strategy and policies. And Maribyrnong's budget for the last couple of years has had a climate emergency statement in there, which clearly outlines for our community where our dollars are going in relation to climate response. And we need to allocate resources, the right ones at the right level. Technical, community engagement, strategic, networking. And in 2019, when Maribyrnong acknowledged the climate emergency, I think we had 2 staff having to do absolutely everything on climate, environment, biodiversity, whatever. And now we have, I think, 4, you can correct me if I'm wrong, 5 wonderful staff, a dedicated manager and department working across all elements of climate and environment. And we can see the difference that that has made in our organisation and in how our organisation works with and supports the community. And that's a good segue, because the next idea I have is supporting the community, working out who is leading the community response. And in Maribyrnong, now I'm going to just get a little parochial. I'm going to give a big shout out to some people in the room. We have Climate Action Maribyrnong, Parents for Climate Action Bike West, Critical Mass has a few rides here. We have Permaculture Out West. We have a Maribyrnong Youth Advisory Group, which is heavily focused on climate change, and the Maidstone Community Centre. They're all working across the community in various ways to raise the issue of climate emergency and to lobby council. I've got 48 seconds. I'm nearly there. But meet with those people, help them to navigate council processes. That's really important for where resources and budget and policy gets directed. Amplify their voices in the council chamber, on social media, when you're going to events. Attend their events. Because by doing this, you're communicating your support directly to them, but you're also signalling to other people that this is important work. And the last 2, provide opportunities for climate champions to talk about climate emergency, but I think most importantly is listen. And we heard those fantastic videos. Listen to the voices of young people, to climate disaster survivors, to farmers, to emergency workers, and those working to protect ecosystems from the onslaught of climate change. And I think if we can do that, we can kind of fit into the radical collaboration and the something optimism, which I think is, for me, the best framing for how we can talk to people about climate change in our communities. Thank you.
Thank you, Bernadette. Thank you very much. Please join me in also continuing that applause. Don't applause yet. Do applause in a moment. For the person that actually didn't accost me in the car park to get the climate emergency declaration, but got me to sign the commitment to actually campaign for a climate emergency declaration. And that, of course, is the wonderful Jane Morton. Jane has dedicated, I don't know how many years of your life to this cause, has a background as a psychologist, but has also done some incredible work thinking about the emergency and how we frame this and how we communicate this. Please join me in welcoming Jane Morton.
Thank you. So yes, I'm talking about how to communicate the climate emergency. And look, we do want people not only to know that the house is on fire, but to act like the house is on fire, to move into emergency mode. I'm going to be talking about some of the ways of doing that. But before I start, I want to acknowledge that we're up against the biggest disinformation campaign in the whole of human history. It's not a mystery why it's so hard to get the message out. Our federal politicians not only are getting funding from the fossil fuel industry, not only getting lobbying from the fossil fuel industry, but are under great threat from the fossil fuel industry of losing their seats if they speak out, which is just one of those reasons why councils are so important. A simple thing you can do is always say climate emergency and not climate change, right? Even if it's warming or global heating, anything except climate change. When you say climate change, you're feeding into the denier meme. The climate is always changing. And there literally is research on Democrat voters in the US. It makes a 9% difference from around 50% to around 60% about whether Democrat voters think that climate is one of the top issues for the government. 9% difference just from changing the language. Same sample, same time. But of course, just telling people, even if we didn't have the fossil fuel industry lying to people, is hard. We're wired, our human brains are wired to pay attention to the tiger much more than something that's sort of happening. Because we look out the window, it doesn't really look like anything's happening right now, not unless the Maribyrnong is actually flooding or the fires are actually burning. Now, fortunately, there is another quirk of the human brain we can take advantage of, and that is that a story or a picture, especially about a particular person, has almost as much effect on our brain as actually seeing the thing happen. So we mostly haven't had our girlfriends die in a crash, but this ad brings it into our awareness, almost as though it's happened. So stories are important. How can you do it at the council level? Well, you're probably going to bring in programs for heat emergencies, right? And you could just frame it positively. Wow, we're doing this good thing. But if you can add to it a story of somebody who's died in a heat emergency or nearly died, it changes everything. 1,000 people dying, that's a statistic. One person dying, suffering and dying, that's a tragedy. Similarly, if houses flood, one of the things that makes people anxious is the risk of not being able to insure their houses. Have a whole council forum on it. We need to bring these future risks into the present, and plus councils do need to be planning. What will happen to those houses that flood once, then twice, then 5 times? But it's partly about the story. It's about telling it so people get the future impacts in their heads now. As David said, what we're risking is food and water shortages, conflict and mass migration on a scale that has never been seen in the whole of human history. And it's playing out already, but far away, in places we don't even really hardly hear about. How do you bring that story into your council newsletter? It's quite hard, but the impact on young people who are too afraid to have kids because of their fear of societal collapse, that's a simple way of doing it. Or having the kids actually talk about it. Another important thing to remember is that we are actually descended from herd animals. Our natural tendency is to look and see, are our leaders running or are they grazing? Unfortunately, at the moment, they're grazing, right? And they probably will keep on grazing because they're actually afraid. Councils have to find a way to get the herd running. A simple thing like a banner at the front is a start, but putting it on the website, yes. Another thing that's very important is emotion. A set of facts just doesn't have the same effect on our brains and on our urge to act as emotion that we catch from other people. That's why Greta works so well. And that's why the things that David was outlining about the scientists getting more emotional, really important too. The facts just don't urge us to act unless the person who's speaking about them shows some emotion about it. So coming to the gloom and doom debate, sigh. I wrote this booklet like years and years ago, and still it goes on. I was distressed to hear that it was going on back in 2006 already. What the research shows, this is from a meta-analysis of 98 studies, is that the best way to move people to action is a personally relevant threat. If it's paired with an action that has any chance whatsoever of actually being efficacious. And no, it doesn't backfire. This is another meta-analysis, 127 studies. It doesn't backfire. That's why we see public health campaigns that nearly always use that formula, threat plus the action to take. And it would be ridiculous to have an emergency message for a fire or a flood where you didn't use exactly that formula. The fire is coming, get out now. So how do we come to believe something different? It's partly some studies that just get repeated over and over, and I'm so running out of time. Fear won't do it is one. Terrible methodology, tiny numbers, and the findings actually were misreported. It's gone all over the world. It's still getting referred to, including by the IPCC from 2011 to 2016, recommending it. Similarly with this terrible study, no, it doesn't backfire. This is again, small numbers, university students doing it for credit as part of their course. Terrible design, and it doesn't even show what people think that it shows. So I just want to devote my last minute and a bit to the 3 Rs. This is David's most important point. It's too late now for emissions reductions alone to save us. Most people don't know this, even including federal politicians. I have been talking to federal politicians about this. A lot of people and a lot of politicians even think that if we get to zero by 2050, somehow everything's going to be fine. Well, no, it's not going to be fine. So we've got to talk about emissions reductions. We've got to talk about degrowth. My grandmother mended socks. Oh, radical. I know, I never did. But anyway, but it's the sort of thing we have to start talking about. Either the society will collapse because we've overshot, or we'll start to make some very big changes fast. Some of the more hopeful bits are about drawdown, like in First Nations times when they were custodians of the land before colonisation, a lot of our rivers were chains of ponds. A very short time after colonisation, they started to turn into channels where the water rushed out to sea, taking the soil. We can rehydrate the land by slowing down the water, revegetate the land, and there's every chance that that will have massive cooling effects on top of the drawdown effects. There's a great big project going on in the Gascoyne River right now in Western Australia, where they're rehabilitating the whole watershed. And there's a huge project, which I was hoping I could tell you about, just about to start in Indonesia. Huge, a huge project of the whole of the watershed of a river. So these are great, big, important projects. They can make a difference, like a lot of it's still not proven yet. The research is needing to be done, massive funds are needed. When the council is doing a small chain of ponds project near the creek, it's a chance to talk about pre-colonial times. It's a chance to talk about that these changes could be absolutely huge. Local cooling, there's even a chance that it can calm the weather by improving the pressure gradients if you revegetate. You're probably not going to be doing marine cloud brightening yourselves over the Arctic. The good news is that they're doing research about using it over the barrier reef. It's actually going quite well in the sense they can get the droplets small and they go up into the clouds. You can tell some of those stories, get visiting speakers, and you can tell the story via practical actions at council level, roofs, pavements, cooling. So as well as being Darebin Climate Action, I'm an Extinction Rebellion, and this is how I try and do the thing of telling the truth but acting as though the truth is real. That's me up on the petrol tanker. So have a think yourself about how you can make this real in the council or in everyday life. And if you want to read some more of the psychology, that's the booklet I wrote ages ago that's still unfortunately relevant.
Thank you so much, Jane. Extraordinary work and extraordinary message, and I'm looking forward when I'm not a councillor to joining you on the top of that petrol tanker. You're going to hold me to that. Please join me in continuing the applause for our next speaker, Rosie Gotel from Gen West, sharing some lessons learnt in communication with cold communities. Thank you.
Thank you. I don't have concussion, but any stumbles I will blame on Adrian's concussion. Although in your case, Adrian, it does seem performance enhancing. I'm Rosie. I work at Gen West, which is a women's health promotion and family violence service in Melbourne's West. We have a wide variety of programs, including a multicultural health education team that I'll be speaking more about today. And ideally, they would have been here presenting this work, but for various reasons can't, and so here I am. But I do work very closely with them, especially on this project. So today I'll be discussing lessons learned in working alongside migrant and refugee communities, especially women, after the 2022 Maribyrnong floods. And while these lessons come from the floods, they're applicable to all extreme weather events and to the way we manage the climate crisis we're in more generally. Next slide, thank you. So I do want to acknowledge the lands we're on and that I live and work on here beside the Maribyrnong River that always have been and always will be Aboriginal land. The word Maribyrnong itself is an anglicised version of a Wurundjeri term that roughly means I can hear a ringtail possum. And we see this as part of the lesson that Aboriginal people have been asking the white world to learn for a very long time, to pause, to sit and to listen deeply to what's going on around us. And this is very much the approach we applied to working with women directly affected by the floods in Maribyrnong. Next slide, please. Thanks. So this is Maribyrnong, the day of the flood in October 2022. It's a relatively dense urban area just a few kilometres from the middle of the city, and there were over 500 houses flooded. So in the aftermath, we were funded to work directly with the community to support its recovery, especially with women with refugee and migrant backgrounds, which is reflective of the demographics of to witness the strengths and weaknesses of communication between governments, NGOs and community. So in our model of community engagement, we recruited bicultural bilingual staff, we built relationships with key community leaders, and we brought together displaced communities, forging community connections often for the first time. We listened deeply to stories, experiences, and what the community said they needed, and we helped people access services to support their recovery. We also conducted research, including a literature review and field research with in-depth which is this. And there are copies of this at the front desk where people signed in. We wrote it deliberately with councils across Australia in mind as the primary audience. Thank you. All right, thank you. I don't know if this one's, oh, great. Thank you. So we shared this quote just as an example of some of the consequences of poor communication. So this was a known floodplain and rain had been constant enough for days here and upstream to raise suspicions that there could be a flood. But those living there still felt underprepared, taken by surprise, unable to take the actions they wish they could have to protect themselves and their families, and confused and fearful and felt a feeling of helplessness in the face of the extreme weather. This fear and confusion and helplessness continued throughout the coming months and even years as the community tried to rebuild and housing and income for months, and many still are. Next slide, thanks. So we know that it's community strength, so a strong fabric of community connections and a higher value placed on care and the status of care, both for each other and for country, that are vital to our ability to withstand and survive the climate crisis. So this requires deep listening, ongoing relationships and trust between communities, councils and other orgs. And I'll show you a little of our approach that enabled this. So we designed a culturally and gender-informed program to strengthen community connection. So you can see here the kind of range of creative but simple ways we brought people together, showing care, acknowledging the effect of prolonged distress, and bringing people together in ways that enabled them to have conversations with one another, with local representatives from community agencies and with our bicultural staff. So you can see kids playing, others receiving therapeutic massages in the back and others just hanging out and chatting. And it was in this way that we were able to listen to people's stories, experiences, expertise, their knowledge of their local area and their plans for the future, knowing that another flood will come. And I think these photos are an example of the kind of radical collaboration that it can be possible with community. Next slide, thanks. So women and extreme weather. So the climate crisis has gendered effects. Gender inequality is exacerbated by climate change, and apologies to Jane and climate change, and rigid gender roles become more deeply entrenched in crisis and disaster. So in Australia, women are overwhelmingly responsible for the majority of household and childcare duties, and women take on an even greater burden of care and domestic labour during crisis. Mothers' mental health in particular is compromised during disasters and extreme weather, including extreme heat, especially those caring for infants. And we know men's violence against women and family violence increases during disasters. Women are often more expected to sacrifice their paid work in order to take on more unpaid caregiving for vulnerable family members and kids. And women typically earn less than men and may be more financially compromised. Because of gender inequity in leadership and decision-making roles, disaster planning and preparedness is weaker and less effective than it could be because it lacks the expertise and wisdom of women. And this quote really just shows how common it was for us to hear about mothers' guilt and shame that they couldn't perform the roles in their communities that they were performing before. And we know that when we involve women in decision-making, it strengthens mitigation and adaptation efforts, improves the adoption of climate change policies and communication, and creates more resilient households and communities. Next slide, thanks. So similarly, for migrant and refugee communities and women, women are often at higher risk of poor outcomes with often less access to information and resources, political power, often limited social capital, and the effects of trauma and distress both pre and post-migration. But these communities also have high levels of resilience, resourcefulness, adaptability, often collectivist worldviews that value care, collective care, and a range of other strengths in emergencies. There's also much that mainstream organisations can learn from the way diverse communities manage and adapt to climate, both here and overseas, including how communities care for one another during crisis. Thanks. So these are just a couple of quotes showing a common story we heard about a lack of information, a lack of knowledge of systems in Australia, and confusion about the support available. We also heard differing expectations of and confusion about various roles of government, council, state, federal, different departments within governments and community agencies in a disaster. And we heard, next please, thanks. We also heard about how beliefs and expectations from people's home countries affected their expectations of climate change here and the actions and behaviour they took in an emergency. And it's crucial to consider this when speaking with communities about extreme weather in their local setting here. So in short, culturally effective communication should be in language whenever needed, facilitated and supported by bicultural staff. It should take into account that some communities have cause to distrust government and agencies, and it should acknowledge that many lack familiarity with Australian systems. It should also acknowledge that we have lots to learn from culturally diverse communities and their strengths and knowledge in managing climate. So as I said, it's strong communities that are resilient communities and ones that know best how to mitigate and adapt to climate change in their local setting. There are many things councils and others can do to achieve this. So workforce diversity, having women and multicultural staff in key community roles as well as in leadership, working with community leaders as information intermediaries, and proactively seeking the experience and expertise of women in all our diversity about our lives and the way climate change affects our lives. And involving women and culturally diverse communities at all stages of climate change and mitigation and adaptation. One more, thanks. So we wanted to end with this lovely quote from one of the women who was whose house was flooded. You know, we all cultivate a connection to the land we're on, and it's only together and with respect for the land that cares for us that we can mitigate the climate crisis we're in. Thank you.
Hold on for that. Thank you so much, Rosie. I'll ask you to stay on stage and I'll ask our other panellists who have all given wonderful presentations to join me. No, we'll get another chair, I think, because there's four of you. So please join me in welcoming back to the stage Bernadette, Jane, Adrian, and of course, Rosie. I'll also just bring to your attention, we're going to have a very brief panel discussion. I am committed to getting you to lunch at some stage, but I do want to have an opportunity to ask some questions of these wonderful folks and also to give you a chance if you've got a question. There is a Slido code up there, so please, if you haven't jump into there. If you have questions, we'll come to those as well. And we'll obviously also give an opportunity for our online audience, because we do have people joining us from all around the country today. So I want to make sure that they have the opportunity to ask those questions too. So thank you so much, everyone, for your presentations. I was almost going to make it a musical chairs thing and see who could survive, but we do have 4 chairs. Adrian, we'll start off with you. Are there any councils in Australia that provide a great example of communicating the climate emergency?
Yeah, I think at Laura's Moonee Valley again, like at least it's on the front page, right? And that's really important, because what I was seeing in the Maribyrnong's, no, I can't talk about my own council. Anyway, no, but it's like a lot of councils have good communications once you get there, okay? But you've got to get there. So it's about being up front and centre and treating an emergency like an emergency. So it's that with Jane's piece about showing emotion, it's a cognitive dissonance. If someone says run and they're calm and relaxed and whatever, you're probably not going to run, right? So if you're talking emergency and it's not featured on your council website strongly, it's just not going to work. And I think from memory, it was Darwin had one of the best framed, like it read like an emergency, like it felt like an emergency. And we've got to do that, and we've got to lift, because our state and federal governments are fossil fuel bound. So they're going to have a hard time coming to the space that they need to, but they will follow, right? They will follow if councils lead.
Fantastic. Thank you, Adrian. We'll go straight to Jane. Jane, you've done a lot of research about people's attitudes towards climate, and especially climate emergency framing. What's the most important or surprising thing that's come out of your research that you can share with us?
The most important thing is that it's not surprising. I think a lot of the summarising of the research has been done by people who are not in psychology, but my work has been in helping people change. And how do you help people change? You help them get in touch with the things that are most important to them, activate emotion that's related to the things that are most important to them, and then they tend to change. There's consistency across a whole vast area of clinical psychology, public health psychology. It's all consistent. It's only this aberrant little mythological area where we think that we shouldn't tell people the truth and we shouldn't make people afraid, even if there's an emergency.
Well put. Thanks, Jane. Bernadette, how has your perspective on communicating the climate emergency changed since going from being an activist in the community and a council employee in another council to now being a councillor?
That's a good question, and I'd forgotten that's what was coming. I'm not sure that it has necessarily changed, because I really think that working with the community and talking to the community and having those difficult conversations and understanding why it is that, councillors put some resources over here and not over here, and why it's taken 5 years to get from declaring a climate emergency, to, wherever we are 5 years later. It's still important. Like, it was important when I was a council officer to support, community action. It was important when I was, not a councillor, to do my own action. And as a councillor, it's probably even more important that I support what's happening in the community and what the community is asking me as a decision maker to act on.
Fantastic. Can I ask, just follow up with that? Do you feel you can have, as a publicly elected person, do you feel you can speak the truth to your constituents now that you're in that role?
Maybe that's a no. I think the conversations become more difficult, perhaps, and more complex, because when I'm sitting with my, and there are 2 councillors here, when we're sitting with the budget, and we've got an ever diminishing amount of financial resources, having to allocate that across a whole number of relevant, urgent, community or environment focused activities. Sometimes those conversations are harder, I think, than they might have been previously.
Yep, good to acknowledge. Rosie, not all council areas have experienced the kind of events that you've just shown us and have been talking about. What messages could they take away about communicating the climate emergency?
Good question. Thank you. I mean, all councils are experiencing the climate emergency, however that's expressed in their geographic region, whether it's floods, fires, extreme weather. So many of the lessons, they come from a flood in this region, and they also depend upon the demographics of the region that we have here in Maribyrnong. But the demographics of your council areas may well be different. You may have more transient communities, you may have a more ageing population, more or less cultural diversity, but the principles remain the same in working alongside community, building trust, building connections, and ensuring that there's a diversity of voices within your own councils or agencies that are informing your planning, your preparations, and your mitigation and adaptation strategies. That's the only way to ensure that all our strategies will be workable and durable.
Thank you. Rosie, I'll get you to hold on to the microphone because we've had quite a few questions come through on Slido, and one of them is directed to you. So I'm going to go straight to that. And a compliment, a great presentation by Rosie. The question is there funding and support for you and organisations like yours to continue the engagement of community beyond this disaster? How do you build on the trust that you've already developed with this community?
Yeah, great question. So we are still working alongside the community in Maribyrnong that was flooded in 2022. We have funding to do that. And there is more and more, we're state government funded, there's more and more state government interest in funding a range of work to do with women and climate change and crises in general. There is funding for that, and it's part of our responsibility to continue to show the case for funding those sorts of.
Yep. Thank you. A few questions have come through which are asking us about how we go about communicating with resistant communities, and also sometimes internally in our own councils there might be resistance to using emergency framing, including with our communications team. Would anyone like to have a go at that? I'm happy for anyone to have a response to that one.
Well, I think showing them the research would be a good start, but I think, like David said, I think it was David, there's a small number really who still think that climate is not an issue. You're best to ignore them. They will eventually follow the herd. When the rest of the herd has run, they will follow. But I can connect with people, obviously, through their own experience. If you're talking to Vietnamese people, maybe have a conversation about the Mekong Delta going under, where most of the rice is grown. There's parts of Bangladesh that flood. A third of Bangladesh has flooded in some of the monsoons lately. Talk to them about their home communities. Well, that's the case because some of them are suffering more, their home communities, than here. But don't give up because 10% are flogging you. Some of it, I think, is a coordinated campaign of trolls and so on. They're trying to make this debate toxic. The main thing is to not give up, because in the same way as if the fire was approaching, you have an absolute responsibility to warn people.
Fantastic. Anyone want to jump in on that one? Yep.
I was just going to add, there are a lot of opportunities to use the words climate emergency. And, somebody can't stop you from using the words climate emergency, even if they're sitting across the chamber and they don't agree that the climate emergency is a thing. So you can still use the words climate emergency if you're a councillor, or if you're, in your non-councillor life, or if you're at other forums, as I said, you can raise that. And I think, there, when I was at Hume, and I know Michelle's in the audience somewhere, we did have this exact problem as officers trying to encourage councillors there to use the words climate emergency. And there was a lot of resistance. But I guess what we did do, sitting alongside of that, was we had a very large budget allocation to putting on solar panels across our 200 plus, buildings that we had in Hume. And that program went on regardless of whether we declared a climate emergency or used the words climate emergency. So I guess that's sort of the flip side. Are there other ways of getting what you want done while you're still pushing the climate emergency issue and language?
Quick question. Is anyone from a comms team here today? Hands? That's sort of the problem in a way, because, so 0, by the way, you don't have to turn around. And it's a communication mobilisation exercise, right? So no matter how many solar panels we put on, how much gas we get off, yes, we're taking leadership, yes, we're getting things moving, but we have to communicate it and drive action and drive motivation and drive community pickup. So it's a comms exercise, it's a mobilisation exercise, it's an engagement exercise that is really at the heart of the great challenge that we've got to do in a very short space of time to make a difference. So
I'm going to take that and carry that to a question that Dale Martin has asked us, and you'll hear from Dale later. How important is it for within a council to have people not just in the sustainability team, but across the organisation working in this frame and on this space? Just if anyone wants to jump in on that, because I think that's kind of really going to the point here.
Oh, it's totally critical, because every context that you can think of, every service that council delivers has a climate emergency element to it. So no matter whether you are on the parks and open space team, in the aged care team, early childhood, finance, or one of those 100+ services, there is a climate emergency elements to it. So if we're going to spread the word, use the right language, and get the right action across all of the services that council delivers, we need everybody on board. So it's 100%, it's 110% important to have people across the organisation involved.
And very quickly, I think I can say positive things about my own council. So we do internal induction, and I had been given 10 minutes. Now I get 15 because it's hard to stop me at 10. And I get to do climate emergency for all staff. And
It's the fossil fuel lobby has just shut you down, Adrian.
Shut me down, exactly. And my favourite one of those was a person that came up to me and said, in 6 minutes, I've been a climate skeptic for 20 years, and in 6 minutes, you've convinced me it's real, right? So, and it is important because we do need whole of council to do this at some point, sooner the better.
Can I add one thing? And it's especially important to have the CEO and the executive leadership team and the senior leadership team and the councillors. Like, let's not give up on providing climate emergency training to councillors who don't think that the climate emergency is real. And I know David's, I can see David who has worked on this for a few years, but it's really important that not just, we need all the officers on board, but we also need the very senior officers and the senior decision makers, which is the council itself, to have that 6 minutes of training.
Absolutely. Just out of interest, I'm going to throw that question, or hands up, I should say. Anyone here from a council where you've done all staff or large numbers of staff trained in climate emergency or the framing or what it is? Hands up. Yep. Okay. Just a few. Okay. Great opportunity. All right. Fantastic. I've got a question here which has got a lot of interest and a lot of support online, which is about how we engage with communities who feel overwhelmed and might disengage with the emergency framing. Rosie, you've been at the forefront of this work recently. Do you want to come in on that one?
Thank you. I think a lot of it comes back to messages we've already heard today about building common ground and finding shared values and then building from there. We heard earlier that there's whatever people's interests are or concerns are, you can bring a compelling climate change conversation into. It's the same with many topics, even those with a conservative bent or who feel passionately and strongly that they are climate skeptics. There's always room for conversation. It's just being creative and creating kind of gatherings where that can happen, where it is a conversation. It's not a lecture, it's not preaching, as we heard earlier, a conversation.
Yep. Anyone else want to come in on that one? No? Yep. There is a question here which is taking us in a slightly different direction, and I think it's worth asking because we haven't discussed it really today, which is how do we begin to communicate the climate adaptation story? As in, how are our communities going to look different in the next 20 years? And what does that mean for driving action?
I think one of the most important things about the adaptation story is to tell the truth. And, sometimes we go, oh, well, we've got to make room for the people from the Pacific Islanders to come. We've got to make room for a quarter of Australia to move south unless we get moving.
And maybe it's joined up with the previous question. It's about building trust with people, understanding where they're at, what understanding they have about adaptation, because it's often the thing that people have the least amount of understanding about, and talk to them, in their own language from their, and I mean that broadly, from wherever their situation is, so that, the message gets across, and again, that it's a conversation, it's not a lecture. I think that those two, questions kind of have this a similar, from my perspective, we should have a similar approach.
Sorry, can I say one more thing?
Yeah.
Got the red card there too. I was doing a talk at Flinders Island, so I had a look at the council map about sea level rise. First of all, it's just way out of date. Like, it was just way underestimating how much sea level rise there might be. But also in really small print down the bottom was, for each metre of sea level rise, there could be 100 metres of erosion. Small print, really small print, So councils are doing planning and people are doing planning based on really underestimating the risk, understating the risk.
Fantastic. There is one question which got a lot of response. I'm not going to put it to our panelists, but I'm going to ask you to discuss it with each other during lunch, which is about the fact that state and federal governments have been described as being fossil fuel bound. What can we do about this? So that's something for you to discuss over lunch. I'm going to give you the lunch instructions in just a moment. They're very important. Before I do that, please join me in giving a huge round of applause for our panel members. Who've each brought their own unique individual perspectives, but also a rich amount of ways forward. And of course, also Belinda, who joined us live from her wedding. Folks, we're going to go to lunch in just a moment. I do need you to have a look at the screen because there is some critical information. If you don't follow this information, you will not be fed. So if I can just ask, I think we've got that. Have we got that on screen there, folks? Yep, terrific. Here we go. Not sure where to go to lunch. Here we go. QR code. If you don't have a mobile phone, find someone who does. Otherwise, you will not be fed. We will be coming back. We were going to give you an hour. I'm going to give you slightly less than that. I know it's terrible, but otherwise we would miss key parts of our program. So we'll see you back at 1:15. Is that right? Yep. That's that. Oh yes, sorry. There are some wonderful people. We have people who have bells. Who will be ringing the bells and leading you to lunch. Follow the bells, all right? For whom the bell tolls gets fed. Folks that are in our sessions just after lunch, please join us down here for a quick discussion. Thank you, everyone.